Wow, good morning. It's so good to see everyone. This is really amazing. This is a full room of educators. What a great event to be at. I know it's obligatory as a speaker, you're supposed to start by saying, I'm so honored to be here. And sometimes I mean that when I say it. And this is one of those times. I really mean it. I'm not just saying it. I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado. When I got in the airplane, there was 4 inches of snow, and it was still coming down. And so when you get an invitation to Fort Lauderdale in February, it just is clearly God's will. And, some events are more obviously God's will than others, and this was one of those, for me. No, I'm joking, actually, but seriously, let me just say something definitively up front, and I'm absolutely convinced of this. This is the greatest opportunity for Christian education in our lifetimes. This is the greatest opportunity for Christian education in our lifetimes. Now, look, there's a lot of things I think that make that the case. One of those things, obviously, is what we have seen nationwide over the last 3 or 4 years in terms of the failure, in many ways, of state-run systems to actually deliver even in education, not even talking about a moral education. I know that what we have seen is explosive growth in many, many Christian schools. And my guess is that's the case for many of you. It hasn't just been Christian schools. It's been really all the alternatives to state-run schools. And I don't know if we should all just get together and write thank you notes to the Loudoun County School Board for that. But there has been an explosion of interest in non-state sponsored schools. And so that's part of this opportunity. Another part of this opportunity is something that another way to describe this opportunity is something that actually I talked about yesterday. Many of you are aware that right now in Asbury, Kentucky, there is a chapel service that has been going on now for 9 days. Now, listen, whether it's a revival or awakening, I'm not going to weigh in on any of that. I spent some time yesterday interviewing for my podcast a professor at Asbury, a longtime professor at Asbury, who also is a theologian and a church historian. And he was just kind of wrestling through what has happened. They don't know how to explain it. They don't know what it is, other than the fact that the last time I was on that campus, which was probably 5 or 6 years ago, I was walked past the auditorium there, and they talked about something that had happened in 1970, where a group of students had been part of a campus revival that they called, they used that word, and obviously it was happening in other schools as well. And that since that time, and if you do the math, that's 53 years. Since that time, there had been individuals praying for 53 years that it would happen again. Now, right now, there are people trying to come in and take over. There are certainly a lot of questions being asked. Some of them, I think, are very valid questions being asked. But when I asked what was going on, one of the things he said, and I think it's interesting, he said that, what I think is happening, at least part of the story here, is that Jesus really wants to make himself known to Gen Z. He's really targeting Gen Z because Gen Z has been brutalized over the last several years. And they have been brutalized, and I'm actually not talking about COVID. The most important things that we can learn out of COVID were not anything that COVID caused. It was what we might call pre-existing conditions to COVID. Things that predated COVID and that were made worse, that were exacerbated in one way or another by the pandemic, by lockdowns, by loneliness, and that sort of thing. And this is a generation that is in desperate need of leadership and guidance from older generations. And that's one of the reasons, that's another reason, maybe the most important reason that I think this is the most important opportunity for Christian education in our lifetime. And another way to say this, if you put those two reasons together, the failure of the status quo and then also the devastation for students, it's this, ready? If not us, then who? There's no other alternative for this younger generation right now other than the God-ordained families and Christian influences, churches and schools in their lives. We have to be there for them right now. It is a devastating state of affairs. I do a daily podcast called Breakpoint in which I talk about what's happening in the culture, and I thought about really going through just here are some of the highlights of the culture, and I'm gonna get to some of those things. But look, we all sense that things aren't okay. I sense it as a parent. I have 4 kids, Abigail, who's a senior in high school, Anna, who's a sophomore, Allie, who's with me, but in the coffee shop, who's in 8th grade, and then we have an 8-year gap, and we have a kindergartner. My senior drove my kindergartner to school. I promise. And he's our only boy. His name is Hunter. So if you do the math, that's Abigail, Anna, Allie, A, and then Hunter, H. Ah, yeah. Look, we invest in their Christian education because we want them to know God. I mean, it's our job first. It's not your job. It's our job first, but we want to bring as many people around them. We want them to know God. We want them to love God. We want them to trust God. We want them to obey God because He is the source of life. And it would be hard enough if all we had to deal with in that whole process of trying to disciple them towards God, if all we had to deal with was their own independent thinking and their own sin nature. I mean, that makes this job that we do hard enough, doesn't it? I learned this very early with Abigail, who's, again, now a senior. I remember when I was traveling once when she was really little. She was, I think, 3, and Anna, her little sister, that was the only 2 that we had at the time. Anna was 1, and my wife called me and she said, "You'll never believe what happened tonight." I said, "What's that?" She said, "Well, I was tucking the kids into bed, and Abigail was helping me tuck Anna into bed, and as she walked out of her little sister's room, she leaned back in and said, 'God will be with you tonight, Anna. God will be with you.'" Wasn't that sweet? Except then she turned to my wife and said, "Mommy, I told Anna that God would be with her, and the other God will be with me." And I thought, oh no. I work for Chuck Colson, and my daughter is a polytheist. How did this happen? But you and I both know that we're not just dealing with the independence of their own thinking. We're not just dealing with their own sin nature. What we're also dealing with is a cultural moment, a cultural context that we don't like. I don't know about you, but there's things that I believe as a Christian that I don't like. Do you believe anything that you don't like? Like, you know, I mean, I believe a lot of things that I like, but there's part of the Christian faith that I don't like. One of those is something that's found in Acts chapter 17, when Paul's speaking to the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers in Athens. And what he says to them is a lot of interesting things as he's talking to these polytheists about God. He says a lot of different things about the relationship of the gods with time and place, and he's dealing with this whole context. And in the middle of this, he says something really interesting. He says, the God who created everything determines the exact times that people live and the boundaries of their dwelling place. Did you realize that? That God has put you in this particular cultural moment and not in another particular cultural moment. And he goes on in Acts chapter 17, and Paul goes on to describe why he does that. And there's some really interesting theological dynamics happening there, that this is actually part of us knowing him. It's not trying to get out of this cultural moment, but actually finding God in the cultural moment. And because God is sovereign over all of history and so on, it's really interesting. But you know, I read that more and more now, and I don't like it. You say, what do you mean you don't like it? He said, because that means that God has my kids. He ordained that my children would be in this time and in this place. I don't know about you, I'd prefer a different time and a different place. You say, when? I don't know, the good old days. I don't know when they were, but I read about them. They sound great on paper. What you do every day as part of these institutions, and it thrills my soul that all these institutions are partnering together like this, but what you do every day is an ordained calling of God for such a time as this. You need to understand what you're part of. A few weeks ago, I was privileged to be asked to speak to my friends over at Focus on the Family in their chapel. We live in Colorado Springs. We office there in their building, and they asked me to speak for the Sanctity of Life chapel service that they have in January. I believe that every single life is sacred from the moment of conception to the moment of natural death, and that you can tell a lot about the health and well-being of a culture by how it treats its children. So I believe in this issue. My mom ran a pregnancy care center for 10 years. I believe in, I am a pro-lifer through and through. I was among many who celebrated last year when the Supreme Court reversed one of its worst all-time decisions, and it's had some doozies. Thank God that Roe v. Wade is in the dustbin of history. But what we saw after the Dobbs decision has shaken me a little bit. Maybe I was naive. I know a lot of us celebrated when the Dobbs decision came out and suddenly the abortion decision was sent back to the states. What we saw in state after state after state after state, even in some surprising ways, was that the rest of the culture was not where the rest of us pro-lifers were. We saw it first in Kansas. Then we saw in Michigan a law, a ballot initiative was passed that was so radical and so extreme, it was hard to actually put together. We now have abortion laws in certain states that are far more radical than what Roe actually was all about. So how do you make sense of this? And I was trying to make sense of, what does it look like to actually continue the work? Because as many people said, the Dobbs decision is not the end of the pro-life movement, it's the end of the beginning. And now we've got to start a new stage in this. And I think that's all true, but I was trying to make sense of it. And there was a passage of scripture that immediately came to mind. And if you have your Bibles or if you want to pull out your smartphones and turn in your smartphones, I don't know, that's so weird to say, to Psalms chapter 11. And there's a verse, and you probably know this verse, and I think it's applicable to what we're doing here and embracing our calling as Christian educators today as well. Psalm 11, verse 3, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? That immediately came to mind because you know what? Law and politics are downstream from culture. So what we saw last year in the wake of the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe v. Wade is that where the culture was at a place where the foundations of human dignity, the foundations of our understanding of the sacred trust between parent and child, those foundations have been destroyed. Does that make sense? So that's what drew me immediately to this idea. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? And I started to look into this verse, and I started to look into it more carefully, and I was surprised to find that actually there's a little bit of disagreement among biblical scholars about what's actually being said. It seems as kind of straightforward, but there's disagreement among biblical scholars exactly what this verse is trying to communicate, what the psalmist is trying to say. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The most common take on this is the take that I took from it and the take that you probably have heard, which is just a basic statement of reality, that you cannot actually be sustained as an individual or as a society if you don't have strong foundations. Now that's an observably true fact. That's a historically true fact that you can't just make your way as a society with lots of new stuff. You have to have strong foundations. You can't just make your way as a society with new technology, and you can't just make your way as a society with new innovative laws. If you don't have a solid foundation, you don't have a future. And that's true for individuals as well. If you don't actually have a strong foundation for who you are and what you believe, how can you actually have a future? You don't. This is actually just math. It's not magic, it's math. Without a foundation, the building can't stand, right? This is observably true. And it's observably true that in our particular context, the context in which you are fulfilling your calling as educators, that a lot of foundations have been destroyed. And people have been talking about it now for a while. I want to point you to two thinkers that have actually talked about this on a cultural level, and hopefully it'll give you an idea of the context in which you live. The first is the founder of the Harvard sociology department back in the 50s. His name is Patiram Sorokin. And Patiram Sorokin wrote this book called The Crisis of Our Age. If you ever can find it on Amazon or whatever, it's worth picking up. But as the founder of the sociology department at Harvard, Sorokin was one of a few researchers, anthropologists and sociologists, that looked back over the great civilizations, or all the civilizations really, of which we had record, and they tried to understand them and what made them grow, what made them collapse, what made them vulnerable, and that sort of thing. And what Sorokin found as he looked at every civilization of which we had record, he came up with four findings, four things that he found. First, that cultures, those civilizations that were able to govern the sexual instinct with marriage were more productive and more prosperous societies. Does that make sense? In other words, as you look back, and by the way, what's interesting about his study, he didn't just look at the Western world, he looked at non-Western cultures as well, right? And what he found was across the board that the productive and can I buy a vowel? The productive and prosperous societies were the societies that were able to rein in the sexual instinct. Maybe you heard this analogy in youth group about you, that sex is like fire. And when fire is in the fireplace, it brings light, it brings warmth, it brings ambiance. But when the fire jumps out of the fireplace onto the curtain, what was supposed to bring light and what was supposed to bring heat and what was even supposed to sustain life is now bringing destruction and even death. Do you see what I mean? So this is what Sorokin found is true, not just about individuals, but entire societies. That societies that did well were able to govern, were able to rein in the sexual instinct. The second thing that he found was the exact opposite. That cultures that actually lost control of sexuality in a cultural, across a society, disintegrated. He basically, based on these findings, he said most cultures either fit into a pattern that he called ideational. In other words, they were living for something bigger than the moment, something bigger. Think about our founding documents. We hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. This is an ideal. It wasn't even a reality when the founders wrote it. It wouldn't be a reality. It's not. Some people would argue, I think, well, that it's not even a reality now, but it's an aspirational idea. The other cultures were sensate cultures. Sensate cultures are those cultures that are spiraling down. They're not living for these great ideals. They're living for the moment. Quick quiz. Between an ideational society and a sensate society, which one sounds more like America today? Sensate. And for Sorokin, the ideational cultures were those who were able to govern the sexual instinct. Sensate cultures primarily were those who weren't able to govern the sexual instinct. Why? Because cultures are like bank accounts. You can't keep spending if you never do any investing. By the way, you can tell a lot about the health of a student, the health of a parent, the health of an institution, the health of a church, the health of an entire society by our ability to delay gratification. If you can't say no to something now for something better later, you don't have a future. Does that make sense? This is what Sorokin found as the founder of the sociology department at Harvard, is that what we know to be true about individuals is true of entire societies as well. The third thing that he found, and this is really interesting, societies that were able to govern the sexual instinct, but then lost that ability for 3 straight generations, ultimately demised. Cultures that were able to govern the sexual instinct, but then lost that ability for 3 straight generations, died. And I don't know about you, but when I read that, I started to count. What generation do you think we're on? 2.5 to 3? His final finding was that there were no exceptions to those other three. A lot of times when you look back at civilizations, you'll find the exception that proves the rule. Sorokin didn't find any exceptions. That's just the way it was. So here you have a guy writing, 70 years ago? Who's basically looking and saying, look, if we don't have an ability to delay gratification, if we're not able to govern and control the sexual instinct with some institution, and by the way, the only institution that's ever been able to successfully govern the sexual instinct is marriage. If we lose that, we don't have a future. But that's not the thinker that I think about most when I read this verse in Psalms. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Because I just spent about 7 minutes there talking about sociology and society, and some of you are like, what's this got to do with me? Here's what it has to do with you. Last week, the CDC released a report about the mental health of teenage girls. How many of you guys know what I'm talking about? Did you know that going into the pandemic, in 2019, it was the third straight year that the average life expectancy of the American male had gone down. Not in 2020, 2019. So that's 17, 18, and 19, 3 straight years that the average life expectancy of the American male had gone down. The last time in US history that had happened, it was during World War I and the Spanish flu. In other words, in the 2010s. Since the 2010s, our medical technology has dramatically improved. Our ambulatory and emergency services have dramatically improved. Our understanding of viruses and inoculations and all those things have dramatically improved. You say, John, what's your point? My point is that we are seeing signs of this sort of thing that Sorokin said at an incredible moment. And we need to be serious about this. I have been struck in the head with this reality about a year ago because I used to spend a lot of time, and I still do, and by the way, you have some great vendors here that are doing some wonderful work in Worldview. I know Elizabeth Urbanowicz's curriculum is fantastic. The Deep Roots curriculum is fantastic. There's a lot of great curriculum, and I used to spend a lot of time and energy in that, and there's such important work comparing worldviews. And this was back in the 90s, and I was trying to introduce students and teachers to really understanding postmodernism, because postmodernism was this ethos that was dominating Western culture. It came from the French philosophers, which a lot of our worst ideas have. And then it took root in Kurt Cobain and Britney Spears and Eminem and the Matrix movies. And so here we are in a postmodern culture trying to make sense of it. And one of the guys that I would point to is a philosopher who was called the godfather of postmodernism, Friedrich Nietzsche. How many of you guys have heard of Friedrich Nietzsche? What's he famous for saying? God is dead. One of the places he said God is dead was in something called the parable of the madman. I want to give you homework. I want you to go home and Google and read the parable of the madman. It's very short. The parable of the madman is one of the places where Nietzsche says God is dead. Now, what he's saying there, and he's living here at the end of the 1800s, is not that God existed and now he's died. He's saying that the idea of God has lost its place in Western culture. The idea of God is becoming less and less believable. It's becoming more and more implausible. And he's talking about what that means. And in the parable of the madman, there's a madman who runs into the marketplace in the bright morning hours and lights a lantern. Why would you light a lantern in the bright morning hours? Because you think everyone's in the dark, or because you're crazy, or both. So the madman does this, and he runs out into the marketplace, and he says, I seek God, I seek God. I'm looking for God. Around him, Nietzsche says, are all of these intellectuals, all of these people who didn't believe in God. So they started to mock him. Has God lost his way? Has God gone on a voyage? Maybe he's immigrated, and they mock him. You know why? Because this is the end of the 1800s in Europe. No one believes in God anymore. And for you to look for God is so quaint and so traditional and so outdated. And then the madman jumps into their midst, Nietzsche says, and he pierces them with his eyes, and he says, I tell you where God is. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But what follows then is a rant but a discernible rant from the madman talking about why that matters. You see, there was this idea by the intellectuals at the end of the 1800s that we could just kill off God and move on with science and technology and everyone would be happier, that we would enter an age of unfettered peace and prosperity. How'd that work out in the 20th century? It didn't, did it? And so here you have Nietzsche, in the words of the madman, he basically says, here's what this means. If you lose God, and he uses all this wonderful imagery to describe what a big deal that is. He goes, to kill off God is like unchaining the earth from its sun. One of the great discoveries of science is that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, but the earth revolves around the sun. What happens if the sun disappears? What happens to the earth? They make movies about this. It's a bad day. The madman goes, is there any up and down? Isn't the world becoming colder? Isn't it lonelier? How do we know what's up and down? And then he says two things that are profound. The first thing he says, if God is dead, are we not now straying as through an infinite nothingness? In other words, without God, what's the point of it all? And the second thing he says is, are we not ourselves going to have to become God? And then the madman looks around and all of his cynics and critics are just looking back at him like he's crazy, kind of like you guys are looking at me now. And he says, I've come too early. When deeds are done, they take time to be seen and heard. This deed, the death of God, is done, but it's still distant. It hasn't quite gotten there yet, but it's coming. In the 1990s and the 2000s, when I used to use this poem, this parable of the madman to talk about the difference of a world with God and a world without God, and how a world without God inevitably evolves into, or devolves really, into a postmodern era. It was hypothetical, it was comparative. Like, if God this, if not God this. But what Nietzsche had predicted was that these realities of being lost in the cosmos, of being alone in the cosmos, of feeling meaninglessness, of thinking ourselves worthy of becoming creators ourselves over ourselves, was actually inevitable and on its way. Folks, it's here. What Nietzsche had predicted has now become not a hypothetical situation that we need to compare for our students. It now is their existential reality. You understand when I say you've been called to this cultural moment, let me give you something about this cultural moment. Let me tell you about the foundations that have been destroyed. The ultimate foundation is trying to imagine and conceive of a world without God. That's a destroyed foundation. And what has resulted now is your students now are living in a world in which there has been 4 catastrophic losses. 4 catastrophic losses. The first is a catastrophic loss of truth. A catastrophic loss of truth. We have removed for them, they don't understand that there's any fixed reference point for them to base themselves. And basically, it's like we've given them a compass to try to find their way out of the wilderness of the universe, but this compass always points at them. A compass works because it always points to something fixed and outside of themselves. Without God, there is nothing fixed. Without God, there is nothing outside of themselves. And so now it's like dropping them off in the jungle with a compass that always points at them. They're the center of reality. Can you imagine something more disorienting than that? Second, a catastrophic loss of love. The most popular and powerful ideas in our culture teach us to hate. The most powerful and popular ideas in our culture are not based on the love. And this is, of course, huge. And if we're actually going to get to the truth, because what's the greatest commandment, Jesus said, is to not to know, not to think, not to trust, not even to obey. The greatest commandment is to love. And the second one is just like it, and that is also to love. There's been a catastrophic loss of truth. A catastrophic loss of love. Number 3, a catastrophic loss of identity. Every single headline that I read every single day, and that's my job, that's what I do. Every day on Breakpoint, I talk about something, some headline, and I try to connect it with a Christian worldview. Every single headline reveals almost, I'm trying to think of one that doesn't. Maybe shooting down the spy balloon doesn't count. By the way, I just said that out loud, which is something about the moment here, isn't it? Every single headline is about a catastrophic loss of identity. One of the great questions of our age, and it shows up in fashion, and it shows up in conversations about sexuality, and it shows up in our conversations about race, and it shows up in our conversations about social class and money and everything else, is this fundamental question: who am I? Who am I? What does it mean to be human? What is the source of my dignity? What is the source of my value? What is the source of my neighbor's dignity and my neighbor's value? So we've had a catastrophic loss of truth. We've had a catastrophic loss of love. We've had a catastrophic loss of identity. And finally, and this is revealed in that statistic that I told you before, that before the pandemic, 3 straight years of the average life expectancy of the American male going down. By the way, why is it going down? It's because of a category of deaths that we now call deaths of despair. That's an official term, by the way. What are we talking about? Addiction, overdoses, and suicide. Going into the pandemic, we knew about the suicidal ideation and the tragedy of suicide that was happening among young people, and then we sent them all home and locked them all up in their homes and turned them onto screens. And by the way, let me just say this right now, especially for you. One of the punchlines of the CDC report about the mental health crisis of young girls, it's screens. Get your kids off social media. Look, I mean, imagine, like taking all of our kids and hooking them up to an IV that just consistently fed poison into their veins. When we gave all these girls Instagram, we hooked them up to an IV that poured poison into their brains. It's insane. And that's what this report has proven, if you just want to go read it. But it's also part of something that's happening in a larger context, and that larger context is not only a catastrophic loss of truth and a catastrophic loss of love and a catastrophic loss of identity, but the fourth one is a catastrophic loss of meaning. A catastrophic loss of meaning. Without a why, you can't even handle the easiest what's. But with a why, you can handle any what. We have a crisis of meaninglessness, and it has to do with the foundations being destroyed. And if you go and fulfill your homework assignment and go read Parable of the Madman, you'll see that Nietzsche called all this 100 years ago. He said that the death of God was going to bring a loss of truth, that it was going to bring a disorientation about who we are, about what the world is all about, and certainly this idea of love. In fact, by the way, he didn't think it was wrong. He actually thought there was no God. He was just trying to call how far this needed to go. There was going to be a revolution. There was going to be a collapse. And he actually wanted that to happen because he thought the only way forward was the strong man. And by the way, does that sound like politics today? The strong man jumping up and running. See, this is all, Nietzsche was a prophet. I know he gets a bad rap because he said God is dead and he died of syphilis in an insane asylum. But other than that, Nietzsche pulled this one off. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? I said that biblical scholars look at this verse and they see it differently. And I don't want to just like, what I'm not trying to do here is just kind of look at this and choose the one that I like the best. I actually look at these 3 takes and I'm like, they all have a really interesting point. And I don't know enough about Hebrew because I went to seminary about 20, 30 years ago. So it's not that funny. The second way that people see this is, scholars see this, if the foundations are destroyed, and they see the verb tense of do a little bit differently. If the foundations are destroyed, what have the righteous done? And basically the take here is, if the righteous aren't working on the foundations, then they're not pulling their job. They're not pulling off their job. If the righteous aren't actually building the foundations, then what are we doing? We're wasting our time. We're painting a house that doesn't have a foundation. Folks, Christian education is more than education with longer skirts and shorter hair. Christian education is more than education with a Bible class. Discipling a young person to follow Jesus for the rest of their life is more than just having them memorize Bible verses. And I'm a product of a Christian school, and I'm grateful for the Bible verses that I memorized. When I graduated from kindergarten, we knew a verse for every letter in the alphabet, even Q, in the King James. Quit you like men, be strong. I still remember it. That's pretty awesome. But the Bible's not just a book to be looked at, and it's not just a book to be regurgitated. The Bible is a book to be looked through to see all of life. That's the foundation we have to work on. Can I give you two foundations? Two foundations that we have to rebuild as Christian educators right now. And I gotta tell you, Bible memorization won't pull it off. A chapel service that simply focuses on Christianity as a personal, private faith won't pull it off. Let me say it a little differently. Christianity is personal, it's not private. What Christianity makes is public truths, statements of public truth about life in the world. This is the way the world is. It's not true for us and not for them, it's just flat out true. Just teaching kids apologetics won't pull it off either. Now let me say this a little bit differently. We can find ourselves as Christians and as Christian educators playing whack-a-mole. Do you know what I mean by whack-a-mole? You know that game whack-a-mole? Like this issue pops up and bap, and this issue pops up and bap, and this issue pops. If Christian education is just about smacking down all the bad ideas they come out with, then we're underestimating how powerful our culture is in catechizing our kids in a completely different understanding of life in the world. Let me say that again. We cannot overestimate, it's impossible, how powerfully culture catechizes our kids into a catastrophic loss of truth, identity, meaning, and love. I don't think we understand this. I'll give you an example of it, maybe that'll make sense. I was speaking with a friend of mine who has a friend who teaches in the school system up in Boston. And she was asking her friend, she teaches junior high, if I remember, yeah, it was junior high. And she said, how many of the kids in your school identify as LGBTQ? Junior high in Boston. Just shout out what you guessed the answer was. How many of them? Half? Nope. 25%? Nope. My friend told me that her friend, the teacher, looked back at her like she was crazy, like, you mean you don't know this? And her response was, oh, all of them do. And she said, what do you mean all of them do? Are they having sex? And she was like, no, they're in junior high. They don't even talk to each other, they just text each other. She said, well, how are they all identifying as LGBTQ? And here's what she said, and this is something we miss in this whole conversation. She said, oh, because no one wants to be cis and straight anymore. One of the things we haven't reckoned with is how all of our really bad ideas about sexuality and identity are now meeting this critical theory mood that's taken over Western culture, where there are good guys and bad guys and no one wants to be the bad guy. And so kids who are nowhere near anywhere on that spectrum are now identifying just because they don't want to be the other guy. Listen, it is one thing. It is one thing for a kid to hold on to their faith when they're made fun of. It's another thing for a kid to hold on to their faith when they're considered evil. That's the world we're preparing them for. So very quickly, I want to give you two foundations that we have to build. These are the foundations, and if we're not building these foundations, what are we doing? The first is the foundation that the biblical account of God's world is the true story of the world. In other words, not just that this Bible verse is true and this Bible verse is true, and we teach the Bible as a collection of what Philip Yancey once called moral McNuggets, but that the whole Bible is true about the whole world, that the Bible is the best account of human existence on the planet. It tells us where everything came from. It tells us where everything is going. It is the story, capital T, capital S. It's not one of the stories, it's the story of the world. How we teach Bible has to be up to speed for the challenges of this culture that from every different direction is telling them a different story of the world. Does that make sense? That foundation has to be built. We have to, in this critical moment, in this critical opportunity for Christian education, maybe the best in our lifetime, we have got to go back and we have to audit our Bible classes. We have to audit our chapels. We have to audit how we're talking about the Bible to our parents. And we have to make sure that our schools are grounded in Holy Scripture as the true story of all of reality, not just as a collection of moral advice. The second foundation is the biblical account of the Imago Dei, the image of God, as the true identity of each and every person. The biblical account of the image of God, and by the way, that includes, and God created them in his image, male and female, he created them. That includes the explanation why God created male and female that we find in Genesis 2 and to which Jesus refers in Matthew 18 when asked about marriage, that there actually is an inherent identity to be human, to be male and female, and together that establishes marriage as the foundation of civilization, and so on and so on. This is a big rabbit hole that keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. And what you need to understand is from the moment that a kid walks onto this planet right now, he is bombarded, she is bombarded with bad ideas about what it means to be human. And these are ideas that have enormous consequences right now. They always have had consequences, big consequences right now. Let me say it a little bit differently. Do you ever look at the headline and go, we have lost our minds? The kids that are looking at those headlines, or I know they're not looking at the headlines, but that are living these stories, into these stories and into this cultural moment right now, the kids, they've never known anything differently. Culture is so powerful by what it normalizes. C.S. Lewis said the most dangerous ideas in a society aren't the ones that are argued, they're the ones that are assumed. It's one thing to have been born 20 or 30 or 40 years ago or 50 years ago, or I'm looking around, I'll stop there, and to see how much things have changed. It's another thing to grow into a cultural moment where you never knew a different. And we're looking at this going, we have lost, I can't tell you how many conversations I have where somebody's like, we have lost our minds. But what if you didn't know what normal was to begin with? We have to recapture the foundation that the Bible is the true account of reality and the image of God is the true identity of every single human person. We have to audit our classes. We have to audit our subject matters. We have to audit our student life programs. We have to audit our disciplinary policies. We have to audit our sports teams. We have to audit our relationship with our parents. We have to audit our relationship with the churches to make sure that those things are being built and put into place, because if not from you, then who? I got 30 seconds. My friend Greg Kokel gives good advice when he says never read a Bible verse. And what he means by that is not to never read a Bible verse, but never read just a Bible verse. And I want to encourage you, because I can imagine coming out of the end of that the last little bit here, you're kind of like, is there any hope? If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? When you read that verse in the context of the whole psalm, you realize that it's not the psalmist that's saying that. It's the cynic. It's the critic. Let me read the whole chapter. In the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to your mountain? For behold, the wicked are bending the bow. They have fitted their arrow to the string to shoot in the dark at the upright in heart. And if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? See, the third way of understanding this, and I think a much more holistic way of understanding this, is understanding that verse 3 is actually words in the mouths of a mocker, of a cynic. And the psalmist replies, the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyelids test the children of men. The Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. Let him rain coals on the wicked. Fire and sulfur and a scorching wind shall be the portion of their cup. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face. In other words, it is true that if the foundations of a society are destroyed, it doesn't have a future. It is true that if the foundations of an individual are destroyed, that's not a sustainable way to live. All of that's true. It's absolutely true that those of us that are trying to help the next generation walk into this cultural moment have to be about building foundations and not just whacking molds. All of that is true. But you know what is ultimately true? Jesus Christ is risen from the dead and sits on the throne of heaven and earth. So as you look at another headline and go, we have lost our minds, here's what you need to understand. There is no such thing as being on the wrong side of history. There's only being on the right or the wrong side of the Lord of heaven and earth. And that foundation is secure. I know we sometimes open the newspaper and go, we've lost our minds. Jesus Christ on the throne of the universe never looks down and goes, ah! He never does that. The future is secure. We are on the side of the Lord of history. So have confidence that we have been called to this moment. And we can do it not because we have strength, not because we have power, but because God has graciously shared his truth with us. Even more importantly, God has graciously loved us with his truth, and he's taught us what love is, and he's given us an understanding of what it means to be a redeemed image bearer, and now we know the meaning of history, and we can raise the next generation to walk into this moment too. Amen? God bless you guys.